feel quite refreshed after that brief mental breakdown, so in this episode of Half Crafted, I'm going to be painting this character model the best I can. And while I do it, I want to talk about the best way to paint your characters. I'm painting Illuminor Szeras, and these are the paints I used. I'm not going to read them all here, but in the description there is a complete list in the order they appear. And of course, if you did want to use this for your own Necron scheme, all you'd have to do is switch out the magentas at the end. I've kept Szeras's head separate as this will be more convenient to paint separately. For the base layer, I'm going with a 2-to-1 mix of Runelord Brass to Vallejo Silver. To apply the base for this model, I'm going to be using heavy dry brushing. I find for my tastes that metallic dry brushing over a black base really gives a good weathered, worn metal effect, and because you're leaving those recesses dark and applying lots of thinner layers instead of a big thick layer of Leadbelcher with a paintbrush, I feel you get a much darker tone to the miniature, which is my preference. It can be very easy to be influenced in your painting style. I mean, right from when you get the box, you're looking at the box art. Games Workshop specifically offer painting tutorials on how to paint like the box art, and that's not a bad thing, they're very helpful, but really experiment, try and find how you like to paint your miniatures. Anti-spill measures deployed here to give this model a good bath of Nuln Oil now that that base coat is set. Now when I say experiment with your painting style, I don't necessarily mean to do that on a character model that you're painting up. These models are likely unique, special, and you want to do a really good job, you don't want to have to be stripping these. Techniques like dry brushing and washing with Nuln Oil is quite basic, so I'm not scared to do this on the model. But we'll be getting to some techniques later on that you're probably going to want to practice first on some rank and file models. Now that that's dried, I'm really liking how the dry brush and the wash have come together to create a very worn looking metal effect. The bronze still shows through the silver, and I'm quite pleased with that as a base. Moving on to some accent colours now. When I first saw the Illuminor Szeras model, I loved how his shin pads had this Incubi Darkness Abaddon Black combination to give it this blued tint. So I took inspiration from that for the accent colours on this model. I mixed Akhelian green contrast, which is really more of a blue, there's not much green in it, with a tiny little bit of Black Templars contrast, and used this on Szeras' shoulder pads, joints, and the shin pads. The advantage of using contrast paints here as well is that the base layer still shines through a little underneath the paint, which means overall less work for me highlighting. Picked out a brush with a good point to it and went around the model highlighting some areas with some watered down Runelord Brass. Little knobs and details, panels standing out on the model, trying to highlight all that detail that's already modelled in. I find working my way around the details of a miniature much more easy when I know that it's just one miniature I can spend more time on. I've kept my dry brush on hand so that if there are any areas that I feel like need a bit more of a lighter dry brush, I can go back in after the wash. And speaking of washes, I'm now going over all those brass details with a little bit of Reikland Fleshshade. This gives them a bit more of a red tint and darkens them down a little bit to be more in line with the rest of the metallics. At this point there's pretty much paint on every part of the miniature body. If you'd like to see how I built up the base, which is a bit unique, a bit different, and how that got painted in the end, go and check out my last video, which covers the base from beginning to end. Less detailed painting in that video, but if you like green stuff, resin, custom bases and skulls, I'd say definitely check it out. Wait though, don't go yet. Are you gone? Hello? Oh good, you're still there. We're just getting to the face. Well, not really all the face, but we're just highlighting some areas on the model that need to be picked out in a bright silver. Are you always spilling your washes? Well, I have no pity for you because the solution is right here. Anti-spill measures. I love these ornate loincloths that a lot of Necron characters have, and on this one I'm doing some glazing to build up a gradient of colour from the top downwards. And while I've got the Reikland Fleshshade out, I'm going to go back over some of the bronze to build up that red tint. Now, techniques like glazing may seem intimidating when you're hearing them, you think I don't know how to do that, but it's much easier to wrap your head around these techniques with a bit of practice and to just break it down. Remember what I said a second ago about building up that red tint? That's effectively all glazing is. Water down the paint you're using appropriately. Now I'm using shades here, so I only need to water them down a little bit as they're already quite thin. But if you're using more full-bodied paint, you might have to water that down a lot more. As long as the paint is watered down enough, you shouldn't really have to worry about ruining your miniature because it will be very subtle if you do make any mistakes. However, it will take longer to build up the desired effect if it's too watered down. Pardon me while I fill in the rest of this head with some Runelord Brass. By the way, if you want to support the channel, check out the Element Games affiliate link in the description and chuck me some pennies if you buy any Warhammer stuff. Sorry, where was I? Oh yeah. From there, all you have to do is apply the glaze over each area, wait for it to dry, and then apply again. And it will slowly build up the colour that you want. The advantage being that positioning each layer, you build up a gradient. Filling in the black stone on Xera's shoulder with Sons of Horus green. And I decided that I wanted Xera's hands to not be shaded with the Reikland Fleshshade I've used on the rest of the bronze, but rather I wanted to use Cryptek Armourshade. It's not a shade I like very much because it's quite high gloss, but I watered it down quite a lot and applied a few layers. Then the Akhelian green on the black stone. This I wish I did water down just a little bit more, as it darkened down the green too much. This is what I mean about Akhelian green not really being very green, it made it too bluey. Cables in Khorne Red. All my Necrons have cables in Khorne Red. It's such a beautiful paint, it covers so well, and I find that it pairs quite well with the energy effect, the magenta energy that I use for my blades. Lots of cables to pick out on this model, but honestly I enjoyed every one. The contrasting red that I'm now putting on the model really starts to give me the feeling that I'm getting somewhere. It's a good feeling to see the progress developing on the model, and I offer up the head here to get an impression of what it's looking like as a whole. I decided that the cranium of Xera's should match the rest of his skull, so I filled that in with brass. Shaded any of the recesses and the side on his big pointy thingy, and used some black Templar contrast to get this cable back to black. For highlighting the cables, I used Mephiston Red. Cables are quite easy to highlight as the natural curve of the cable sort of gives you an impression of the area that needs to be lighter. If you're not confident with a steady hand for highlighting, I'd recommend trying a stippling effect where you sort of tap the paint onto the areas you want to be lighter. As you add tiny amounts of paint, it will build up a lighter area. Just again, make sure that paint is watered down. I went back in with the dry brush on the loincloth, trying to build up a slightly brighter edge. And the utmost metallic areas on Xera's body, like these spines, I thought needed to be a bit brighter. Easy to hit with a dry brush, can't go wrong. I started to block in all the areas that would be magenta with AK white. Again, I can't stress how important it is to have a good white paint in your paint selection. It's useful for so many things, and if your white paint is more like cottage cheese than paint, it's going to make your life hell. Don't do it. I've been doing these magenta effects on my Necrons for quite a while now, and it is quite tedious. I wanted a way to make it a little bit easier. What I came up with was the Doomfire Magenta Contrast Paint by Citadel. By basing with white and then painting the Doomfire Magenta over, it makes sure that the Doomfire Magenta is still very bright, and as it's a contrast paint, you get the white from underneath. And then to go back over with any white highlights, and then my magenta paint that I've been using for ages from Vallejo. Together this creates a really good effect, and it covers much quicker, so I'm not spending absolutely ages going back over and over an area with magenta fluorescent from Vallejo and ending up with a chalky effect. For the mystical orb in Xera's hand, I needed to add a little bit more definition to make it look like a swirling moving object he was holding. Returning back to glazing, I'm using some watered down matte medium mixed with white paint to make a white glaze. This will be used to make a white gradient on the tips of the blade, so that the colour towards the tips of the blade is more intense than on the end. This will make my life much easier when it comes to glazing the blade again with magenta paint. This boy got so many glowy bits, I honestly missed a few going around the first time. His left arm is basically lit up like a Christmas tree. I would love to try some full object source lighting on a model one day, but this is not the one. It would take such a long time to find everything that should be reflecting off of everything else that I would never get the model done, and I want to play with this model because he's badass on the tabletop. So you can see with the prep we've done, it almost acts like a brightness slider towards the tip of the blade. The levels of white at the end are much higher, so as we glaze over the magenta, that will follow suit. It's incredibly thin, the magenta paint that I'm glazing over, and that's how we want it to be. If you're cautious and not sure that your paint is the right consistency, try it on the back of your hand before you apply it to the miniature, and hopefully this will give you more of an impression of how it flows off the brush and how it looks when it's dried on the hand. Obviously, each glaze layer needs to dry before you apply the next one. However, the advantage of the paint being so watered down here is that it dries much quicker. One of the only areas on this model that I actually tried traditionally edge highlighting was the black stone on Szeras' shoulder. I wanted to bring back some of that green and a bit more brightness, so I worked around very carefully highlighting with a couple of greens, building up to just a dot of white at the corners. For edge highlighting the metallics, I worked around the model with a bit of Runelord Brass mixed with Stormhost Silver, focusing on the most raised, upward facing areas. Just adding tiny little dots of brighter metallic. I'm not a massive fan of the traditional edge highlighting style where everything is extremely cleanly lined. I admire that people can do it, but it's not my personal way of painting. I find it too stressful. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't wish I could do it. There's an expression you may have heard in miniature painting that goes, faces and bases make models aces. And I've definitely kept that in mind while working on this miniature. I spent a lot of time on the base, and I want to spend a lot of time on the face as well. What this expression means really is that those are the areas that eye is drawn to on a miniature. We know that characters don't exist in a vacuum, we want a context for what we're looking at, and from there our eye is drawn up to the face, which acts as the identity of the character in most cases. I realised while I was painting this head in a piece of blue tack that my hands were getting very sticky, and thought if only there was something I could stick this to stop that happening. So I stuck it to something. After I filled in any areas of white that had been overbrushed while painting the rest of the face, I followed the same magenta steps I'd done on the other magenta orbs on the model. I also used some Nuln Oil and a little bit of black Templar contrast to slowly add a gradient to Szeras' chin to make it quite black at the bottom. Next, Szeras' lens on the side of his head. I wanted this to look less like the eyes and orbs on the rest of my Necrons and more like a glassy, glossy lens. So I mixed together a series of progressively darker greens in my wet palette. The principle of this is that the dark green acts as the base, and into the bottom right hand corner, progressively the greens get lighter and lighter. Then in the top left hand corner of the lens is a tiny dot of white. I can't say for sure what this extra lens on the side of Szeras' head does lore-wise, but my personal headcanon is that it's linked to all the gadgets and gizmos on his body, the black stone, perhaps like some sort of Necron array of lenses like we have on the back of smartphones that allow him to see warp energy or cosmic winds or other cryptek-y things. With my size 0 brush, I slowly worked my way around Szeras' head with some Stormhost Silver and some Runelord Brass. Any areas that I'd shaded down too much, I brought back some of that initial colour, very carefully, making that upper middle third of the face really pop and stand out. The two parts of the model are now completed and ready to combine. I scratched away some of the paint at the point where the head connects to the neck. It's important to make sure that there's a good plastic on plastic connection when you're combining pieces of subassembly. If there's primer and acrylic paint in the way, it's unreliable that you're going to get a solid bond, and you don't want the head falling off your big character in the middle of battle. That would be embarrassing. Applied some Tamiya thin to the connection point, and then attached the two. I used a couple pieces of sponges to avoid scratching the face that I'd worked hard on, and then applied pressure with the tweezers to make sure there was a good connection. And with that, Illuminor Szeras for my Hekhsekhan Dynasty was complete. Thank you for sticking with me through this project. It's been a long one. I am so glad to have this miniature completed. If you enjoyed the process here, make sure to check out the previous video building the base, and have a good one.